start here. I'll have to let people in along the time that you're talking. I'm sorry about that.
Oh.
So thank you so much, Natasha, once again for accepting the invitation. Good evening for the ones who are in Brazil, and good afternoon for the ones in Arizona time. I'm really grateful that we have this talk today, because I know Natasha for quite a while back, and it's been ages that I haven't seen her, and she accepted gracefully. It was super nice to have this talk by her today, and even in a topic that is such an interesting one, right? The relationship between original indigenous languages and psycholinguistics, right? So Natasha Warner is a professor, right, in Arizona University of Arizona, and she's the head of the Department of Linguistics now. And she also directs the phonetics lab there, right, Natasha?
Mm-hmm.
And well, she's very known in the linguistic world, and very known especially for her work in phonetics, right? And also her interests and interfaces with psycholinguistics. So I welcome her, and we're very happy to have you here, Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm going to start the PowerPoint. And hopefully, okay, are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes, it's
okay.
Full screen.
Okay, if anything seems to be going wrong with the PowerPoint during the talk, please tell me out loud, because I can't see the chat right now.
Sure. No worries.
Okay, so I'm talking today on kind of an unusual title: Language Corpus Creation, Language Diversity in Psycholinguistics, and Community-Driven versus At Least Harmless Research. And I want to mention my co-author, who is Kirina Giri. She is the chairwoman of the Tamian Nation, which is a Native American tribe in California. And I've worked with Kirina for a long time, and she's a large part of the work on the Mutsun language that I'll discuss. She was not able to be here with us today. So first of all, psycholinguistics only studies a few languages, maybe more than a few, but not very many out of the languages on Earth. There are about 7,000 languages on Earth. And I think we could probably all guess that most psycholinguistic papers focus on English. Then I started to think, just based on my own experience of psycholinguistics, what other languages are there a lot of psycholinguistic papers on besides English? Based on your own experiences, what other languages do you think are represented in the psycholinguistic literature? Anybody want to unmute yourself and tell me what other languages besides English?
I've seen many studies in Finnish.
Oh, okay.
Irina is saying German as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Dutch, because a lot of what's going on in psycholinguistics is in the Netherlands as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Portuguese don't have much, but yeah, I think that's
not as much on Portuguese, but some, yeah. French. So when I started to think based on my own experience, that was about where I went too, although I didn't put Finnish at the top. I thought English, distantly followed by Dutch, German, Spanish, French, Japanese, maybe Mandarin. And then far more distantly followed, like one or two papers each, Sisutu from South Africa, Berber from North Africa. This is just based on what I was familiar with off the top of my head. Cantonese. Okay, that's a lot of languages, but relative to 7,000 on Earth, it's not much. And I think we all know that the vast majority are on English. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm ignoring the extensive research literature that has attempted to expand the languages we work on in psycholinguistics beyond English, and that shows that it does matter which language you're processing, and therefore we do need to study more languages. So Ann Cutler, for example, pretty much spent her entire career showing that it matters what language you're listening to for the questions that we ask in psycholinguistics. And therefore, we need to study many different languages. And studying English, or even English, Dutch, and German and Spanish, is not enough. Steve Levinson and his group have made huge contributions to doing psycholinguistic studies with understudied, underdocumented languages. Asfa Majid, another one. So I don't mean to negate the fact that people do psycholinguistics on a wider variety of languages, but I think we can probably all agree that the vast majority are English and that English is overrepresented. This also depends how broadly we take psycholinguistics. So I tend to think of the kind of psycholinguistics I was trained in, spoken word recognition, button press reaction time responses, conducted in the lab, playing carefully controlled stimuli to people to see how long it takes them to recognize words. Psycholinguistics can be a lot broader than that. So if you take a lot of studies about how children learn to read as being psycholinguistics, or a lot of studies about how people learn second languages as being psycholinguistics, then the pool of languages in the literature does get larger. I decided to check rather than just assuming I was right. I was pretty sure that English had a strong bias in the psycholinguistics literature, but I decided to check. So I sampled 3 psycholinguistics journals: Language, Cognition, and Neuroscience, Journal of Memory and Language, and Cognition. And Cognition has a lot of papers on visual perception of pictures, so on that I used only the language-related articles. And I took 2 recent issues of each one, very recent issues, and I counted up what languages were in how many articles. And if a language was, if an article tested 2 languages because it tested L2 acquisition or bilingualism, then I counted the article twice. 31 of the articles tested English, and this is across the 3 journals. 5 tested French. 1 of those was Canadian French. The rest were European French. 3 articles each tested Mandarin, Spanish, and German. I underlined Mandarin here because Mandarin is not Indo-European. All the rest of these, English, French, Spanish, German, are Indo-European languages. So they're also not representative of the world's languages in that most of them are from one language family, Indo-European. 2 articles tested Portuguese. Isn't that nice for this conference? 1 Brazilian Portuguese, 1 European Portuguese. 1 article each tested Hebrew, Basque, Japanese, Nicaraguan Sign Language. That one made me really happy. And a few articles were hard to classify. Hebrew, Basque, Japanese, and Nicaraguan Sign Language are all not Indo-European. And Basque is, at least under some definition, endangered, although it's doing better than most endangered languages. So that's the sampling I found among those 6 issues across 3 journals. I was actually pleased to find that many articles on that many different languages. I thought the bias towards English would be even stronger. But you still notice this is over half the articles are on English. I also want to bring up here the Bender rule. I don't know if people are familiar with that. It's named for Emily Bender. She makes a point of saying that she did not name it. Somebody else named it after her. And it's more known in the natural language processing, NLP world. The Bender rule says that you should state what language you're studying, because in the natural language processing literature, it's very common to not even say what language you're studying, and people just assume that natural language is the same thing as English, and of course it is not. English is not representative of all 7,000 languages. Now, when I started looking through these journal articles looking for what languages were tested, it would be really nice if I didn't have to go down to the participants subsection of the methods section of the first experiment to find out what language is tested. I wish that people would state what language they're testing in the abstract. Ann Cutler taught me not to state it in the title because then people assume that your article is only relevant to that language. But you could state in the abstract what language you're studying. Okay, now it seems like this is a criticism of the field of psycholinguistics, and it is. So I wanted to think about some reasons why this lack of linguistic diversity is bad for the field of psycholinguistics. So let's assume that if we kept counting more articles, that maybe we would get up to 70 languages. Now, that list I showed you didn't even get to 10, but let's assume, or about 10, but let's assume that maybe there are psycholinguistic articles out there somewhere on 70 languages of Earth. That would be 1% of the world's languages. And the vast majority of those are Indo-European. So if we're only studying maybe 1% of the world's languages and not representative for language families, we're missing things. So whatever questions we're asking about psycholinguistics, we're missing things. There's this beautiful article that just came out recently by Blasi et al. Over-reliance on English hinders cognitive science. And they go through several ways that English is not only not representative of the world's languages, but might even be misleading the field of cognitive science to reach conclusions that really are not about language. I recommend that article. One might also think of books like Ann Cutler's Native Listening, which really shows that it matters which language you're listening to. And therefore it matters which language we study. And the answers we get to our theoretical questions are different depending which language we're studying, which means that studying 1% of the world's languages at most means that we are missing things. Now, one can understand that the sort of old assumption in the field of psycholinguistics was what we want to know is how the human brain processes language, any language. And therefore, it doesn't matter which one we study. English is enough. But in the meantime, we know that's not true. That's just not true. We know that the morphology of a language, the syllable structure, the prosodic system, let alone the syntax, affect how listeners process information. And since all of those things vary across different languages, we need to know about how our psycholinguistic questions apply to many different languages. Basically, if there's a pattern, listeners will use it, and patterns differ across languages. Listeners are really, really good, and this is something Ann Cutler showed in a lot of her work. Listeners are really, really good at finding patterns in the language they speak and using those patterns to predict upcoming information or to narrow down what they think they're hearing. And language is filled with patterns. That's what language is. It's just a whole bunch of patterns, and they differ across different languages. So because of that, we need to be studying a wide variety of languages, ideally a representative variety of languages, but we're probably not going to get that. To give a few examples of how morphology can differ across languages and how this can affect specifically spoken word recognition, so one specific topic in psycholinguistics. When I've got a whole bunch of steady speech stream coming in my ears, how do I get words out of it? Almost all studies of spoken word recognition use languages like English and Dutch that have roots and only a few suffixes per word, if any, and languages that tend not to have a lot of prefixes, and their prefixes are derivational rather than inflectional. Because of this property of these languages, we can ask things like, what is the uniqueness point of the word captain? Where in that word does it become that there are no other words in the lexicon that have the same string of segments? Is it after capt? Is it after capta? Captive? At what point does it become distinct from cap, cat, or catalog? At what point can the listener tell that they're not hearing catalog? Okay, and in a language like English or Dutch, this kind of thing makes sense, and we can look up this kind of information. In most of our experiments on spoken word recognition on languages like English or Dutch, the stimuli are monomorphemic. They're often monosyllabic. So to take one example from an experiment from the mid-90s that my lab is currently replicating on English, and the original experiment was James McQueen and Dennis Norris and Ann Cutler. It looks at listeners trying to recognize real words like shrimp versus slim when they're embedded in following nonsense like shrimp pole versus slim pole, and whether they're faster to hit the button and say, I heard a real word, for shrimp versus slim. Notice these are both monomorphemic and monosyllabic, no suffixes or prefixes. Now, compare that situation, recognizing shrimp versus slim, to Navajo. I'm going to refer to it sometimes as Navajo and sometimes as Dinebazad, which is the Navajo word for Navajo language, because at my university and my department, our faculty member who teaches Dinebazad recently asked us to change the name of the course to Dinebazad instead of Navajo. But this is the language that people are familiar with as Navajo, a Native American language of Arizona and New Mexico, especially. Now, I apologize for pulling this figure from Wikipedia. I think they're taking it from Morgan Dictionary, which explains it very thoroughly, but the formatting on Wikipedia was much easier to see. So the Navajo verb is, and the whole Athabascan family verbs are incredibly complex. And notice, can you see my cursor here? Notice that the stem of the verb.
Natasha, let me ask you something. Could you accept this little bar here under your presentation that says that
you hide? Okay.
Yeah,
whoops.
hide, please, because.
Are you still seeing the PowerPoint?
No, actually.
No.
Something happened wrong there.
Something happened.
Okay, but it disappeared. It disappeared, right?
Yeah, it disappeared, but now it wants to.
You can try presenting again. Just show your PowerPoint, and then if you read it, we have it.
Right. Let's try it again.
It's just that it was.
It's in the way.
Your sentence. Yeah.
Yeah, and I tend to fill my slides and put stuff at the bottom.
Okay, I think.
Okay, are we back to PowerPoint?
Yes, but the bar is back there. I don't know why.
Yeah, I can't get rid of. I don't think I can get rid of the bar without. What if I hit that pause button? No.
But we can see the cursor. Yes.
Yeah. Can you still see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll try to make sure to read those very clearly, the parts at the bottom.
Sorry.
You try to drag it at the top somewhere?
Yeah, let me drag it. How's that?
Yeah, it's
perfect.
better. It's
Great.
not
Good
on any sentence. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry for interrupting.
Are we good now? No problem. Are we good on audiovisual now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so notice that the stem of the verb is way over here in position 10, and that we have prefixes running from position 0 through 9. Now, not all of those are filled in a given verb, but the Navajo verb is very heavily prefixing. And the meaning of the stem often is not what we think of as a verb meaning in English or related languages. So here's an example, and the stem, bas, means to roll around object. So a lot of the stems have to do with motion and the shape of the object. And then here's two examples of actual Navajo verbs. I'm not going to try to pronounce these correctly. And then over here, it shows you the string of prefixes that those came from. So one of them means I'm starting to drive some kind of wheeled vehicle along. And remember, the root, the stem, means to roll around object. And if you put some of those same prefixes in a different order and use some different prefixes, you get, I'm in the act of driving some vehicle into something and getting stuck. And that's one verb with a whole lot of prefixes. The other thing to notice here is that Navajo Denebazad verbs have a lot of morphophonological changes. So this string here shows you the underlying string of prefixes. And notice that in this one, the a, glottal stop a, the vowel a has deleted and left just the glottal stop. And in both of these, there's a prefix bardel, tla, and in both of them it has deleted, and yet the meaning is still there somehow. So a whole lot of morphophonology happens, and you take this huge string of prefixes and it basically compresses down to 2 or 3 syllables, often 2 heavy syllables, or like here, 3 syllables. Now, how does spoken word recognition work when a listener hears verbs like these? The meaning, the semantics, is constructed between the prefixes and the stem in a very different way from the languages that we test in our experiments. The morphophonology that deletes a whole bunch of prefixes is just incredible. How do listeners do spoken word recognition, and how do they go about putting the meaning together as they hear the verb? We don't know, and we're not going to find out by studying English and Dutch. Here's another language example, Semitic. This one is better known. If you've studied Introduction to Phonology, you've probably studied this. The non-concatenative morphology that's common in Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew. So I've put an Arabic example here from a phonology textbook. You can see that there's a triliteral root, a triconsonantal root, DRS, which is common across all of these. And the DRS carries a meaning like study. And then depending what vowels you put and what syllable template you put, and sometimes whether one of those consonants gets geminated, you get a whole bunch of different meanings. So that led psycholinguists to wonder, how do listeners of Arabic or Hebrew sort out the meaning between the triliteral root and the template that it is overlaid on? And so psycholinguists have, in fact, studied this in Semitic languages. So Marlson Wilson studied it in Arabic. Usishkin, my colleague Adam Usishkin, studied it in Hebrew and Maltese and continues to, and other people have as well. So psycholinguistics did go study these languages because the morphology was just sitting there saying, look, this is totally different than English or Dutch or French or Japanese. And so that did lead people to broaden the list of languages studied. One more example of very different morphology. Scottish Gaelic has a thing called initial consonant mutation, which is common across all the Celtic languages. And you can see here in this example, so if you have an underlying consonant like pia, I can't pronounce these right, but something like a piaun, that means her pen. And you have this particle, which can mean either her or his. If it means her, you keep the underlying pia. If it means his, you get initial consonant mutation, and the pia turns to a fia, and you get a fiaun for his pen. Or you can have fia, which is underlying, which is not caused by initial consonant mutation, and which sounds just like the one caused by mutation, where it means her. Also fia. So when a listener is hearing a Scottish Gaelic word, how do they decide whether they're hearing a mutated consonant or something that was underlyingly a fia in the first place? And it's not just P and F. This happens to a whole set of consonants. Okay, so my colleague Adam Usishkin and I, along with a larger research group, including a native speaker from the community, got a chance to study this in Scotland. It was a fantastic chance to do this research. We did a whole bunch of experiments in the larger group, but 2 of them were most obviously psycholinguistic, the priming study and the gating study. And Adam and I published a paper in 2017 on these, on the question of how does lexical activation work while Gaelic listeners are listening to words that might have consonant mutation or might not. Now, I'm not going to go into what the results meant. You can read the paper if you're curious, but that's what these results are about. I want you to notice here that Scottish Gaelic is an indigenous endangered language. It is still Indo-European, but it is indigenous and endangered and not commonly represented in the psycholinguistics literature. And it's pretty severely endangered. Okay, so I've talked about ways that all of this is ways that failing to study a broader range of languages is bad for the field of psycholinguistics. But it's also bad for students. It's bad for students from indigenous communities. So despite a lot of progress, psycholinguistic work on endangered or indigenous languages is rare. And so when we have graduate students who are members of endangered language communities, they notice that they're not seeing their language or languages like theirs in the literature that they're reading in class. And because of that, they feel like they don't belong in that literature. This means that the field of psycholinguistics is losing potential future researchers. I asked a student of mine, Corey Roberts, who is from the Tutelo language, which is a Native American language of North Carolina. I asked him about this. He sent me kind of a long quote. His quote actually focused more on loss to the field by not finding out about different languages. But he also says that, so he says, in studying psycholinguistics, specifically second language acquisition, I struggled to find ways to apply the subject matter to my language and language situation. The studies in the field were conducted primarily on Romance and Germanic languages, with a few being done on Mandarin, Korean, and Japanese. How would phonemic inventories overlap and blend for a bilingual speaker of English and a North American language, with frequent phonemes quite different from the languages that pervade the literature? What would morphological decomposition look like for bilinguals who spoke a polysynthetic language? Could it be that the fields of second language acquisition and psycholinguistics, as they are currently studied and understood, apply only to a limited range of languages rather than universally? He ends, the field may never know. But he also told me that failing to find his language or languages like it in the literature he read, and he had just read Ann Cutler's book, Native Listening, failing to find languages like his made him feel like he didn't belong. I found that Anne dedicated her entire career to broadening the range of languages we study, and yet, still, this has that effect. Okay, so I've just talked about a couple of kinds of reasons why lack of variety of languages in psycholinguistics is bad. But there's also an argument that that lack of variety in the research is good, which seems surprising. What if we actually made psycholinguistics representative of all the world's languages? This leads to a question: do indigenous or endangered language communities actually need or want psycholinguistic studies? They probably don't. And this leads to the thought of community-driven research. I'm not sure if that's a term that you have run into or hear. The terms keep changing, of course. Community-driven research is research where the community asks for the research to meet their language goals. So community language goals is things like, kids aren't learning this language in the home. We would like kids to be learning the language in the home. Or we would like to increase the number of fluent speakers. Or other things like, we'd like to be able to do a prayer in our language. Or we'd like to have signs around in our language so people see it. Okay, so community-driven research is research where the community asks for it in order to meet their goals. Psycholinguistic studies are likely to be a very low priority because they're unlikely to meet needs in the community very often. This is where it comes to the idea that if you're not going to be doing community-driven research, you should at least do research that's harmless, that's not hurting anything. And maybe research that is somewhat helpful, even if it's not exactly something that the community came to you and asked for. Psycholinguistic research can benefit endangered language communities or indigenous communities because it can show that outsiders and their institutions value and respect knowledge of the language. So when you have a bunch of outsiders who are professors at some fancy university coming in And they want to do experiments with people who are fluent speakers of the language, and they show a lot of respect toward those speakers, those fluent speakers. That can raise the prestige of the language in the community. It shouldn't, right? We don't want people to value their language based on whether outsiders show respect for it, or whether fancy universities in other countries show respect for it. But it can have that benefit. It can also have maybe an indirect benefit, especially with applied psycholinguistics of L2 acquisition, where you might find out something that helps with language teaching. But mostly, I think those benefits are likely to be pretty indirect. The people teaching the language in the community, they already know how to teach their language. You are unlikely to find a psycholinguistic result that suddenly helps them explain their verb, if they don't already know how to explain their verb. So it's important to think about community-driven research. What research does the community want in order to meet their goals? And then beyond that, to make sure the research that we are doing, if we were to try to make psycholinguistics more representative in the world, to make sure the research we're doing is at least of some benefit and at least doesn't hurt anything. Now, I'm going to shift directions a little bit here and talk about constructing corpora as a prerequisite to doing psycholinguistics. And I'm going to talk about the language I work with the most, which is Mutsun. In order to do most psycholinguistic research, we need information like word frequencies, phoneme transitional probabilities, knowledge of what is not a word in order to make stimuli for, say, lexical decision. And most languages on Earth don't have this information available. So we might think that for many languages, constructing a corpus of the language is the first step toward being able to do psycholinguistic research. I'm going to talk here some about a corpus that my collaborator, Kirina Giri, who is from the community, along with two former students of ours, Lenica Butler and Heather Van Volkenberg, about a corpus that we published last summer. And we call it the Mutsun Text Collection. And I'll fill you in on what that is. One point to notice here, it runs to almost 7,200 pages. And it is published as open access. You can download your own free copy. If you Google, you don't need to write all those numbers down. If you Google Mutsun Text Collection, you will probably find it. Not that you're going to run right out and read it, but just in case you want to, it's available. So some background on Mutsun, on the language. Mutsun is a Costanoan language. That's part of a larger language family, Utian or Penutian. And it's a California Native American language. I'll show you a map in a second. The last fluent speaker who acquired it as a child was Mrs. Ascension Solorzano. She's shown here in the picture. Actually, they've asked me to refer to her as Doña instead of Mrs. I meant to fix that, Doña Solorzano. We call the language dormant or awakening because there has not been a fluent speaker since 1930 when she passed away. We used to call it dormant, and then recently my collaborator Kirina said to me, how long do we have to call it dormant? We've been trying to use the language for years and years now. When can we say it's awakening? And so we switched to calling it awakening. Notice we do not call it extinct. People don't like to be told they're extinct, and they don't like to be told their language is extinct. And besides, if people are learning the language and using a few words, it's not extinct. Okay, there is extensive written documentation of this language spanning from 1807 to 1930, and I'll show you some of it. There's been an active community language revitalization program since 1996. Here's a map. That red arrow there is pointing roughly to Mutsun. It's somewhat inland from that, from the Santa Cruz Bay there that it's pointing at. That green area here, this is Costanoan. This is a language family with 8 or 9 languages in it. California, before the Europeans got there, was the second most linguistically diverse place on Earth after Papua New Guinea. Look at how many languages are in California, and keep in mind that green part is 8 or 9 languages. Okay, so that's where Mutsun is from. There's various documentation available on the language. And the earliest is from Arroyo, who was a priest in the Spanish mission in that area. I'm not going to go through the details of these, or I'll talk about them forever, because I can talk about these for a long time. Miriam did some field work in 1902 with Doña Solorzano's mother. Harrington is our main source. He worked on it in 1922 and 1929 to 30. He left about 36,000 pages on this language. That's a rough estimate. He worked with Doña Solorzano. Here's just some quick samples of them so you see what we're looking at. This is Arroyo. Good luck, right? I can't read this. Lucky for us, there is a typeset version. The typeset version was done after his death, and the typesetter introduced a lot of errors. But, well, at least we can see the letters. Harrington is our main source. This is a sample of a typical Harrington page. So picture having 30,000 some pages of this, and there's not much of an index. Good luck, right? His handwriting is awful. This handwriting up at the top, the good handwriting, that's actually where he employed Doña Solorzano's granddaughter, Marta, to recopy stuff for him. Marta has good handwriting. We like Marta. Okay, so here's another sample of Harrington. And once you get used to him, he's actually not so bad. I can read this just fine. Oxedotes hemech a trades, numan hemech a kodotka, wak oxe hinne. Himi oxe hiwan sinnise. Hoyo haisane oxe. And this is the start of a story about sort of a demon character who went around capturing children and eating them. At the end of the story, the good guys win, by the way. And the kids get him back too. And this is the only story we have recorded in this language. We have a lot of sentences and words, but not a lot of stories or connected texts. Notice, one thing to notice here is that Harrington's use of punctuation is shaky at best. What's a sentence? I don't know if that's even a meaningful question. And of course, it's messy, and he corrects himself a lot and things like that. Not easy material to learn from or work from. We put it into a database. We put all of it into a database, about 45,000 words. That is, as far as we know, all the written documentation of this language. There is no audio documentation. Now, we probably missed some, but we got everything we could find. It took us 24 years to put this in the database. The database we used is the Flex software, Fieldworks Language Explorer. It's created by SIL, and it's made explicitly for this purpose. And it's very nice software, but it has a learning curve, and it's not meant for the community to use. And that's a downside. This is that same entry. Oxedotes hemecha trades, numan hemecha kodotka, and so on. Beginning of that story. You can see we put a lot of information in. We put in what we think the sentence means. We put in how it was written, spelled in the original. We put in what page it came off of. We put in any notes, because Harrington scribbles a lot of notes on the page. We put a lot of stuff in. We put in what the original translation was. In this case, he didn't give us one. Good luck. But we can actually read this sentence pretty easily from other knowledge of the language. So it made, by computational linguistic standards, it's a tiny database, but for us, it's a huge database. Then we printed that out to PDF, and formatting, you can see the red here. This is because the community said, hey, can we make those 2 lines red? And a pronunciation guide on the bottom of every page. And you can see this is page 5064, and this is that same entry. We got community input on what would make it easier for the community members to use. And here's the next couple entries of that. So that's what the text collection looks like in published version. We also uploaded and archived backups of the database and an XML version of the database so that it could be used for, say, computational linguistics work or something. Flex also makes a lexical database. You can see here the lexical entry for trades, man. I'm not going to go into details on this. From that, we published a dictionary. It's also published as open access. You can download your own copy. If you search Mutsun English Dictionary and one of our names, you'll probably find it. Here's a sample of the dictionary page. There's a lot of things in this dictionary that are not standard formatting, and these were done with input from the community who said, you know, it'd be a lot easier to read this if you could put a black box before those words. So we did. Formatting seems silly. It seems like content is what's important, but in a dictionary, formatting is everything. So we did this with a lot of rounds of community input. Now, back to psycholinguistics. The Flex software is nice in that it makes it very easy to get frequency information and to make concordances. Concordance is not the word usually used in psycholinguistics. A concordance means give me all the entries in the database that contain this root or this suffix or this allomorph or this phoneme string. So we can get frequency information very easily. So for example, this is a concordance on the verb loote that means to be or to exist. And I can see right away that we have 107 tokens of loote. And I can skim down and see what suffixes it occurs with or what clitics. I can see the entry that one with the past tense is in. I can see which sources it comes from. So I can get a lot of frequency information within Flex. And of course, you can also export and calculate other frequency information. Now I want to come back. This is like those examples I gave of languages have really different morphology and that might affect processing. Mutsun has this beautiful metathesis. Metathesis where you flip two sounds around. Mutsun has 3 types of metathesis. They are pervasive in the language. There's one type that makes a switch between nouns and verbs. We have 205 sets of nouns and verbs that are related by metathesis. So for examples, hapbet, sweet potato, if you flip that final T and E and shorten the P, you get hapte, to gather sweet potatoes. Isn't this beautiful? As a phonologist, this should be beautiful, or morphologist. Sarai, a crow, the bird. Salya, to catch crows. So you notice if the noun is a plant or animal, then the verb means to hunt or gather the plant or animal. Chayich, strength. Chaichi, to be strong. It also happens in borrowings. Huwas, grapes, borrowed from Spanish. Husa, to pick grapes. You might think 205 pairs is not a lot, but that in our database, in our documentation of the language, that is a lot. 9% of all verbs and 15% of all nouns do this. There's metathesis in some other places in the language I'm not going to go through. So there's a lot of metathesis in the language. One thing we find, and this is where it comes back to psycholinguistics and processing. Do we have a problem?
No, not from our end. Maybe
Okay,
your
my computer
is with your low battery.
Yeah, but my battery is plugged in. Just a second. I know what's wrong. Hopefully that should do it.
Okay.
I think it's plugged in, but the battery, but I think the power strip might have been off, but it's supposed to be plugged in.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll be okay. Tell me if anything else bad happens.
No, from here it's all good.
Okay.
From our end.
Okay, so in the documentation, we found some unexpected cases of metathesis where it doesn't fall into any of the known patterns of the language. So for example, we found 2 tokens of holo for the verb loho, to be lazy, which has 20 tokens as loho. So there's metathesis occasionally where we don't expect it. This could be because the language was undergoing attrition and Doña Solorzano didn't know all of the words completely for sure. What this makes me wonder in terms of psycholinguistics, the language has pervasive metathesis all over. How does this affect speech processing? If you had an English speaker and you asked them about the word for to be lazy, I don't think they would ever say Zayli. Maybe it was Zayli. So I wonder if having so much metathesis in the language affects processing in production, possibly as well as perception. We can't test it, but maybe it does. Okay, having corpora is not enough to do linguistics, obviously. So corpora can get us this information about frequencies. but it can't get us psycholinguistic behavioral data. And we can't do that on Mutsun because there are no fluent speakers. For another community, say, that does have some fluent speakers, it still might not be right to do psycholinguistics because it would take the community's time away from other language work. If you have only a few fluent speakers who are elders, their time needs to be spent on language revitalization, if that's what they want to do, not on psycholinguistic experiments for theory. I also wanted a little aside, I'll try and keep this short. On our materials, the Mutsun text collection, we added this note saying, if you're going to use this for research, please try to contact a member of the community, not to ask permission, but to let them know what you're doing. And this is because Kirina has found, my collaborator, that very often they don't know what people are publishing about their language or their culture. And sometimes when they happen to read something published about them, they say, that's not right, and nobody told us. This is a very different approach from what we're used to as academics, that if Smith 1990 published a book and it's in the library, you can cite it, and you don't have to get in touch with Smith. And so we're used to a very different approach where if it's published, then it's out there in the discussion. But the thing to notice is that members of indigenous and endangered language communities, they're not part of the broader academic discussion. They're not going to hear about what people are saying about them. And so in this case, we've asked people to contact someone, to do their best to contact someone from the community, just to say, hey, this is what we're doing with your language. Okay, there are other situations, though, where it is possible to do psycholinguistic research. It might be possible on Navajo, Dene Bezad. There are enough fluent listeners. It's possible to create stimuli, although it's difficult. The community-driven priorities, like revitalization, are being done by a very active revitalization movement on the Navajo reservation. It would be arrogant and inappropriate for us to walk in and say, hey, let's teach you how to revitalize your language. And so it's not our place to go in and do that. And so maybe we could do some psycholinguistics work, but the Navajo Nation research permission process is prohibitively difficult. And although this is frustrating, especially for Navajo researchers, it's a type of community choice saying, no, we've been used for research for many decades without really being asked. We don't want it. Scottish Gaelic is a little different situation. It was possible for us to do psycholinguistics on Scottish Gaelic, only thanks to extensive expert collaboration from a community member, Muriel Fisher, and from the local college there, which is the Gaelic Language College. There is, again, a local language revitalization program in place. It's not our place to come in and say, let's do revitalization for you, because they're doing it better than we could. And our work brought some benefits, maybe indirect benefits, but some benefits. So that's a situation where I feel fine about doing it, even though this work is not community driven. On the other hand, we could be expanding the pool of languages that psycholinguistics studies much more broadly without going to languages where we would be interfering with the community. We could be doing psycholinguistics on Malayalam, language of southern India, Tamil, Hindi, Cantonese, Urdu, Indonesian, Swahili, you name it. There are so many languages of the world that are large, stable languages spoken by millions of people with governmental support, not endangered, where we could be doing psycholinguistics on them if we tried harder to recruit collaborators and students from those languages. We could be doing psycholinguistics on a much broader range without doing any harm. So to wrap up, and then I can check my battery, we should focus on community-driven research first when we're working with an endangered or indigenous language community. That community-driven research is unlikely to be psycholinguistics. It's also unlikely to be formal phonology or theoretical syntax. It's likely to be very practical and applied. That's okay. It doesn't mean that we can't ever do psycholinguistic research on a broader range of languages, because in some situations, community language needs are being addressed within the community. And it's possible to do psycholinguistics while at least not doing damage. And we could much broaden the pool of languages we study in psycholinguistics by looking at more large, stable languages like Tamil and making sure to get the expertise involved to do those studies. But one of the points is that creating corpora of more languages, which doesn't do damage, could at least bring up more ways that human language processing might differ. And that's where the Mutsun metathesis comes in. We can't do a psycholinguistic study of the language, but creating the corpus has pointed out to us a way that human language processing might differ because of metathesis in that case. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Natasha.
I'm going to check my battery here. Oh, it says I have plenty of battery. 90%. Good. Okay.
Okay, that was not the problem then. But that sound came from you, I think.
Yeah, something dinged.
Okay. Natasha, I believe we have a lot of thank yous and wonderful talks from the audience. Mayusi Mota. I saw one comment here by Irina. Irina, would you like to comment yourself or would you like me to read it?
Oh, sure. I was wondering, you mentioned cognition and Journal of Memory and Language, but you didn't mention the conferences. And if you look at the CUNY conference, although now it's called HSP or AMLAP, you will see a much wider variety of languages. They just, these research studies just haven't made it into publication venues yet.
I think you're absolutely right. The journals were what I could do a survey of pretty quickly. But yeah, I could check the conferences. I think one thing that's showing us, though, is that it's very difficult to publish studies on a wide variety of languages in the psychology journals, especially. The 3 journals I chose are pretty much psychology journals. Even when Adam Usishkin and I published that paper on Gaelic, which we published in a linguistics journal, not in a psychology journal, it would never have made it through a psychology journal. And even in a linguistics journal, we got comments from reviewers like, 20 listeners really isn't that much for this kind of study. And we're going, yes, it's a severely endangered language. You are not going to get more listeners than that. Or comments like, well, you haven't controlled for level of fluency of the speakers. No, in fact, we cannot control for level of fluency of the speakers because it's a severely endangered language. So you can't publish these studies. It's true that the conferences have a broader range, but you can't publish them in the psychology journals, and sometimes you can't even publish them in the linguistics journals because people say your methods aren't up to our standards. Well, our standards are based on English or Dutch or something. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the number of languages being studied is higher, and you can see that in the conferences, but that doesn't mean the problem is solved.
I think that the way for us to perhaps address that is to recruit qualified students from the indigenous communities, because they're the ones who will be able to do psycholinguistics. Like you said, that Navajo materials are difficult to construct. So I assume that none of you who are not native speakers of Navajo are able to do so.
No way.
If you have, if you have Navajo students, and this is how Eastern European research has been progressing in psycholinguistics. Eastern European students come to the States. I'm in New York. They get trained and they come back. And now if you look at what used to be a desert of psycholinguistics and Slavic languages, it's actually a better field than it used to be in the United States.
The Navajo
how do we get these students?
I don't know. My department is. But I think part of that is, so if you're specifically thinking about students from endangered and indigenous languages, going to the full range of the languages with the least speakers, they're not seeking out PhD programs so they can become psycholinguists. They may be seeking, a few are, but most are not. Most are seeking out PhD programs or master's programs so that they can do language revitalization work in their communities. That's why my department department has a relatively high proportion of Indigenous students because we teach that and we emphasize that. When we really get down to Indigenous and endangered languages, these languages need so many things before they need psycholinguistics. So I would rather suggest that if we want to broaden the pool of psycholinguistics research, we should focus on the large, stable world languages like the ones of India that I mentioned, which I included because I have a student from India, and she said, you should, when I presented this to her, she said, how about including some of the languages of India? Because you could readily do this kind of work. In the case of Navajo constructing the stimuli, I did work with a colleague who is a native Navajo speaker, and we were working on designing some experiments. We wound up not being able to get all of the full permission needed to do it. But yeah, there's no way that a non-native speaker can construct stimuli for that. And really for any language, I mean, I did a project once on Korean, and I was collaborating with a native Korean speaker, but I had an idea about how I thought things worked, and I made a big mistake in experimental design because I thought I understood how it worked. Yeah, even collaborating with a native speaker, we need to be careful on these things. And
But
even for a language like
your colleague from the native speaker of Navajo, she or he could get the permission then, or
no,
they
we couldn't get
allow.
permission.
Okay. Yeah, one thing
Even
that
for
I
Navajo researchers.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, but I understand that because at least here in Brazil, people collect data. They really use the knowledge of the native speakers and they don't cite them, or they make them anonymous. They are the first author or the only author of the papers. You know,
Yeah, there's so
and
many.
the knowledge doesn't come really from them, right? It's coming from the informant, right? So
Right, there's so many issues about research ethics that get into this. In the case of Navajo, it may be a special case because they've been used for outsiders' research for so many decades. Anthropologists, linguists, public health, and many other things. There has been so much research done on them that if they say, you know, I'm tired of it, that kind of makes sense.
So, but maybe they were also tired of so many things got done in those those studies because it's a danger that we incur in, because if you're not the native speaker, if you don't live in the community and in the culture, right, we have an outsider view of the culture, the language, everything, and we based on our own. I think it's quite natural to do that, but then it's not right. It's not the real representation of the language or our culture, right?
And for example, on Gaelic, the only reason we were able to do it was Muriel Fisher, who is a native speaker and a member of the community and lives part of the year there. And there's no way we could have even started on stimulus creation without Muriel's collaboration.
Yeah, you said when I asked you for this talk, to invite you to this talk, you said, but building a corpus is too little. I think it's so much because of the reasons you pointed out, right? Because if you have the corpus, right, we don't need to do damage to the community or interfere in anything, right? Once it had been collected, the interference is minimal, but I think we should cite the informants anyway, so they should be acknowledged. But yeah, corpus is very important for psycholinguistics, as you cited, as you said. Any more questions?
I see one in the chat, a couple in the chat. Let's see here.
So a lot of wonderfuls. Leticia, I'd like to ask how you characterize harmless research. I was a bit, can a psycholinguistic study that focus on English be really harmless? Okay.
Yeah, so I may not understand the question here fully. psycholinguistic studies on English, where we run them here in the US or in another English-speaking country, and we bring in a bunch of students who are taking our classes, and they participate, they listen to sounds, they press buttons, they get some extra credit in their class for participating. I view that as pretty harmless. I mean, nobody has to participate, they have other choices. Doing a psycholinguistic study on English in a different language community, I guess then it depends what the situation is and why you're doing it on English. If doing
that, Natasha, you said doing psycholinguistics without doing harm, or we may harm, or it cause damage, right? What did you mean with that?
What I'm mostly thinking of is that community-driven research is important. If it's an endangered language community, then even if they say, yeah, it's okay if you come visit and do this thing, we don't understand why you're doing it, but yeah, it's okay if you come do it. You need to look at what the community needs for their language. What is the community trying to do with their language? And if we're coming in and using their time to do psycholinguistic work on their language, or to do formal phonology or formal syntax, it's not just psycholinguistics. If we're coming in and using their time to do research that is theory-driven, research that is motivated by trying to answer a theoretical question and publish papers, and that language is endangered, and it's not being, it's the language community's goals for the language are not being met already, then we are doing harm by taking away the attention and the time of the native speakers from the work that they actually need in order to revitalize their language or to do what they're trying to do with their language. And so it's important to think about, if you're gonna go do research on an endangered or indigenous language, is your research gonna do any harm? Is it going to bring a little benefit? Is it going to be something that they really want, community-driven research? And we should at least make sure that we're doing research that doesn't hurt the language.
Building a dictionary, I think, is a really nice outcome for them as well, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Mayus is asking questions, right? So, in relation to the corpus, did you get funding to build it?
Yes, for a part of it. We got funding from the National Endowment for Humanities, the NEH, which covered about 2 years of the 24-year project. So yes, we got funding, and it was specifically through a program of the NEH for taking culturally important materials and making them accessible. So it can be used by a local library that has old copies, hard copies of newspapers to scan their newspapers. It's for making culturally relevant materials accessible. But it only funded 2 years of the project, and it took us 24.
Wow. Yeah. Well, here in Brazil, I very often ask myself, because I saw so many foreigners working on our indigenous languages, and then I ask myself, why is that? Why Brazilians aren't doing it, right? So I realized that because of the lack of funding, right? Because, and especially now with this past government, our situation got a bit worse, right? Even some, so fundings at all levels have been cut, and we are really in a red flag for science in Brazil in general. So Mayusi also asked, what about training students, research assistants, who gives them training in this case?
Yeah, I guess I don't know what works well at your university or in your country. What works well here is our PhD programs. So when we have students who are interested in doing psycholinguistics, we train them as part of the work that they participate in the lab, or doing their prelim papers and then their dissertations. So I guess the faculty who are already working in areas like this train them. Now, when it comes to training graduate students how to do ethical research in indigenous or endangered language communities, my department is pretty strong on that. That doesn't mean that we never make mistakes. We surely do. But my department is pretty strong on like faculty saying, look, is this what the community needs? Is this okay to do in this community? And also we have a large number of Native American graduate students, as well as some Native American faculty, and they will call us on it. They will say, hey, why are you doing this kind of work with this community? So sometimes the graduate students train us too.
Yes, I was especially concerned about the training on the construction of the corpus, I believe, in the special situation of the indigenous languages, right?
Yeah, I would say again that faculty train the students, grad students or undergrads. So my two co-authors, Lenica Butler was one of my grad students. She actually did her dissertation on that metathesis pattern using the corpus that we created. And Heather Van Volkenberg, she's American, so I'm not saying her name in Dutch. Heather was an undergrad student with us at the time that we had that NEH funding. And so I hired her as an undergrad research assistant, and she typed in a large portion of that data. And in terms of creating other corpora beyond this language, well, Lenica, who got trained on this, is now employed by the Wiyot tribe in Northern California. And she's doing the same thing with Wiyot, which is also a dormant language. So she got trained to do it here in our department during her PhD program, and now she's doing it with another language. And there's other faculty here in my department, as well as, of course, faculty in other places who are using either Flex or some other software to create corpora like this. Then it goes beyond the corpus and Flex. Flex, like I mentioned, is not community oriented. It's very difficult for community members to even learn to install it on their computer or get the file open. But the Miamia tribe in Ohio has developed software called ILDA, Indigenous Language Dictionary App. And they developed it for their own language, but now they're importing other languages. And so we're going to have a Mutsun dictionary with audio words you can click on and listen to that you can access from your phone or a website. And we're getting that with ILDA. So we all train each other, but largely, yeah, the faculty who already work with databases like this and construct corpora like this train students in the process.
And how is the revitalization going for those languages, Mutsun and, I'm sorry, not, the other one by Mutsun is not from California, right? Sorry.
Yes, it is.
Oh, yeah, it's the one by California. And the Navajo. Navajo is very broad. There are many.
Yeah, Navajo is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Mutsun is a dormant language or awakening. We have no fluent speakers, no speakers learning it as children. But the community has a lot more access to it than they did 20 years ago. So my collaborator, Kirina, has raised her kids at least knowing some words of the language. And many other members of the community at least know a few words. And like, they'll use them in Facebook posts. They'll use the phrase for "I love you" in a Facebook post, or "happy birthday." And that's access to the language that people didn't have 20 years ago. We have worked on things like creating textbooks and doing language workshops and classes. There's a lot of things that make that harder, like California is a big state and people live far away from each other. And there's other things that make it harder. But people at least have access. And we also did a workshop where we passed out free hard copies of the dictionary to registered tribal members. And we did a workshop on how to use the dictionary. That was in 2017. And it was amazing. We had about 80 people there, and it was so happy. So people have access to the language that they didn't used to have, even if they don't know how to put a sentence together yet. And Kirina is working with a group of community leaders and on language lessons and practice and trying to get further.
That's amazing. I hope they get there.
Yeah, Navajo is a completely different situation. If you look it up, it might say that there's 100,000 fluent speakers. Of course, that depends how you count and when that was measured. But it has really suffered on children learning it in the home. There are children learning it in the home, but not that high of a percentage. But Navajo has a lot of immersion schools. So on and near the reservation, the Navajo reservation, there's a fair number of Navajo immersion schools that teach entirely through the medium of Navajo or entirely in the first year and then gradually transition to English over several years. And so that's something you can do when you have a lot more speakers like that.
Amazing, Natasha. Would you like to leave us a final message concerning this topic?
Community-driven research. Find out what the community's language goals are and think about that first before you think about what papers you want to write in order to answer a theoretical question.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. It was amazing.
Thank you, all of you.
People really liked your final lesson here.
Thank you, all of you, for making it here late in your evening.
No, it's not that late. Don't worry. But thanks a lot for you, for your time. I know you're very busy. And
Oh, I enjoyed doing this.
it was great to see you and hear you again. I hope we can do more of that in the future. Thanks a lot.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, all of you, for listening and for your good questions.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah.